My name is Bridget Lane. I'm 36 years old. I work for the Defense Intelligence Agency, though not in the capacity most people imagine. I'm not the analyst hunched behind a monitor. I'm not the interpreter you spot wearing a headset at an international summit. I'm the one they never mention in briefings. The one whose name is uttered only in hushed tones inside secured rooms, whose face appears on no documentation, whose records are sealed more tightly than reinforced steel. They call me Ghostwalker, and the only reason you're hearing that name right now is because 6 words altered the course of everything. It happened at a promotion ceremony held at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The hall was filled with senior-ranking officers, contractors, advisors, the sort of people who carry heavy decorations and an even heavier kind of silence. Among them was my father, Colonel Thomas Lane, retired. I hadn't laid eyes on him in nearly 3 years. Not since he looked directly at me and said, "You're wasting your time with all these languages, Bridget. 9 languages won't make you a soldier." He had ridiculed me for years. Every commendation I earned that wasn't a sharpshooter's badge amounted to nothing in his estimation. He believed in boots, bullets, and battlefield scars, things you could hold in your hands, things that bled. So when he received an invitation to this ceremony, believing it was for someone else entirely, I kept my silence. I settled into a seat 3 rows behind him, dressed in a plain uniform. No stripes, no ribbons, nothing to draw a single glance. My name was absent from the printed program. My photograph appeared on none of the slides. That was entirely by design. The announcer kept the introductions deliberately vague. Today, we recognize a member of the DIA whose work has directly prevented international conflict across 5 theaters of operation, who has served in silence, who speaks 9 languages fluently. That's when my father scoffed, loudly enough for half the room to catch it. 9 languages won't make you a soldier, he muttered, shaking his head. The man seated beside him chuckled. Someone else shifted uncomfortably in their chair. But I didn't move. I was accustomed to it. I was accustomed to being unseen. Then the microphone at the main podium crackled, and a voice cut through the air like a blade. Not the announcer's voice. No, this one was deeper, commanding, seasoned by war. It was General Latimer, my current commanding officer. He stepped forward without opening a folder, without glancing at any notes. He simply fixed his gaze across the room and spoke 6 words. "We need Ghostwalker in the room." At first, there was confusion. A few heads turned. Whispers rose. "Ghostwalker? Who?" Some looked toward the hallway, expecting someone to enter. But I was seated 3 rows back. I rose from my seat and stepped into the aisle. Every footfall echoed. My father turned slowly in his chair, frowning. Then his eyes found mine. Recognition took longer than it should have. He blinked twice, then stood, not in anger, not in disbelief. He stood at attention because every officer in that room had already done the same. They knew the name. Ghostwalker. I walked past my father. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. And when I reached the front of the room, the general simply nodded. No applause, no music, only silence. The kind of silence that follows the impact of shockwave. I turned toward the assembled crowd. Some wore expressions of guilt, others of pride, but no one looked away. I turned back to my father. He was still standing, and for the first time in my life, he had nothing at all to say. My name is Bridget Lane, but to them, to the people who've reviewed my classified files, to the men I've pulled out of enemy prisons using nothing but dialect and intuition, to those who know what I've accomplished without ever knowing my identity, I am Ghostwalker. And my father had just learned that the same way the entire room had, with 6 words and a silence that finally communicated everything he never did. I grew up in a house where silence carried weight. Not peace, not calm. Silence that pressed against the walls like a separate presence. It wasn't the quiet of comfort, but the kind that warned you to step carefully. My mother was ill for most of my childhood. Lupus. It claimed her energy first, then her appetite, then her voice. I was 8 when she stopped going outside. 9 when I began helping her wash her hair. 10 when I realized I had already memorized every sound she made because they were the only gentle ones left in that house. My father, Thomas Lane, was a soldier long before he ever enlisted. That's how he carried himself. as though orders were embedded in his spine. He wasn't abusive, not with his fists, not in ways anyone could point to, but he had a way of looking straight through you when you let him down. And silence was the instrument of his punishment. We didn't share dinners together. Not genuinely. He'd eat in uniform at the far end of the table, phone pressed to one ear, a boot propped on the opposite chair. If I brought him a report card, he scanned it for math scores. If I mentioned something I'd read that interested me, he'd ask, "Is it from a field manual?" No, then it didn't matter. By age 11, I had assembled a small library beneath my bed. Worn paperback from garage sales, discarded dictionaries, a shortwave radio I'd salvaged from a junk pile behind the fire station. It barely functioned, crackling through most nights. But when it caught a signal, I'd freeze, heart pounding, trying to hold it steady. A weather broadcast in Italian, a love song in German, a protest transmission from somewhere in Eastern Europe. That radio was the first time I truly understood how vast the world was and how many versions of truth existed beyond our four walls. I remember the first time I spoke a complete sentence in French. I was 12. I had rehearsed it in my mind for weeks. I found the truth in the words of others. I said it at breakfast, not loudly, just enough to be heard. He looked up from his coffee, paused, then said flatly, "That won't get you out of push-ups." He thought he was being clever. Then he added, "It's useless." That was his preferred word when it came to my interests. Languages, books, poetry, useless. What he meant was not tactical, not lethal, not battlefield proven. In his world, if something couldn't win a war, it was of no consequence. So I stopped speaking French aloud and learned Russian in my closet, Italian from a smuggled audio course on cassette, Arabic from a woman who worked at the laundromat, who noticed I was reading detergent labels in 3 different alphabets. She taught me how to say courage without using the word itself. At night, I would line up phrases in my notebook like troops, quiet, disciplined, awaiting orders no one would ever issue. I was never grounded. I was never praised. Mostly, I was ignored unless I stepped out of line. Then the silence fractured into command. He deployed often, and each time he returned, his medals grew shinier and his standards grew steeper. His voice got louder. Mine got smaller, but I kept learning, not for him, for myself. Because every phrase I mastered felt like a door he couldn't lock. By 16, I could speak, read, and write in 5 languages. But at home, I still said yes, sir, and no, sir, and never voiced what I was truly thinking. I used to dream that one day he would overhear me speaking with someone in a language he couldn't understand, and that he'd ask, "What did that mean?" And I would say, "It means I am more than you ever saw." But that moment never came. Not then. And by the time it did, it wasn't me who had to explain what I was. It was my commander, and my father couldn't deny it, because the entire room had already risen to attention. I received my acceptance letter on a Tuesday. Thin government-issue paper, sharp corners, dense ink. I held it in my hands as though it might ignite. Full scholarship, ROTC, linguistics. It wasn't just the funding, it was a future I had carved out in secret, word by word, book by book, radio frequency by radio frequency. 4 years of university, paid in full in exchange for service. It was everything I had worked toward, and I had done it entirely alone. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that evening, waiting for my father to come home. I had placed the letter exactly where he usually set his keys, hoping he'd read it before even removing his boots. He walked in around 8:20, still in uniform, mud streaking his sleeves. He glanced at the envelope, picked it up, read the first line. Then he folded it in half and set it aside, right next to the grocery list. No nod, no smile, just a low grunt. "Guess you'll be speaking 10 languages by the time you're done," he muttered. He opened the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of orange juice, and left the room. That was the entirety of it. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of how hard I had worked. No pride. No joy. Just a man incapable of recognizing value in anything beyond his own comprehension. The last time I had seen that particular weight in his eyes was a year earlier at a retirement ceremony for his old commanding officer. At the close of it, they gave a special commendation to one of the guests, the son of his closest friend from the 75th Ranger Regiment. The young man was 19 and had already completed sniper certification with distinction. My father beamed. He turned to me and said, "Now that's a soldier." That line stayed with me, not because it wounded me, but because it confirmed what I had always known. His version of pride came in specific shapes only. Rifles, medals, ranks, not books, not words, not me. Still, I packed my bags and left for university 3 months later. I chose a school 6 states away, far enough that he couldn't simply show up, close enough that I couldn't honestly call it running. ROTC wasn't easy, but I flourished in ways no one anticipated. I learned to shoot, to lead, to remain composed when people underestimated me, which was frequent. In between field drills and obstacle courses, I studied phonetics, syntax, and regional dialects. I didn't merely learn to speak. I learned to listen. I worked double shifts tutoring fellow cadets who struggled with foreign language requirements. I rewrote outdated training manuals into plain language for humanitarian deployments. I even developed a simulation program that used accent variation to train soldiers in identifying regional threats in the field. No one from home asked about it. No one called, not even once. Sometimes, walking back to my dormitory from the library at midnight, I'd wonder whether he even remembered where I was, whether he still viewed me as someone who had chosen a soft path. But then I'd recall that folded letter, the way he had placed it beside the grocery list as though it were a coupon or a receipt. That was the moment I understood I would never earn his approval on his terms. So I stopped trying. Instead, I focused on becoming something different. Not louder, not tougher, just sharper. More precise, like the words I loved, cutting clean through, even when unspoken. By graduation, I had been offered 3 intelligence internships, 1 special clearance opportunity, and a quiet recommendation for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I accepted before the ink had dried. No party, no photographs, no posts on social media. I sent 1 email home. The subject line read, "Graduated." The message read, "DI starts in June. Hope you're well." He never replied. But I wasn't surprised because in our house, the only thing more resonant than silence was disappointment. And I had finally decided it was no longer mine to carry. I began working for the DIA 2 weeks after graduation. There was no welcome banner, no onboarding video, just a badge I wasn't permitted to show anyone, and a series of rooms I wasn't permitted to discuss. They told me on the first day, "This isn't a job. It's a silence you wear." I understood completely. I had been wearing silence for most of my life. My title was deliberately ambiguous, linguistic field support specialist. But my assignments shifted every 90 days. 1 month, I was embedded with military police in Georgia, parsing coded transmissions from extremist groups. The next, I was flown to Ukraine to cross-reference documents that had never officially existed. After that came Tunisia, then Syria, then 2 weeks sealed inside a container in Djibouti with nothing but a heat lamp, a radio, and 3 translators who refused to meet my eyes. No one ever addressed me by name. Not in the field, not in any reports. My name, Bridget Lane, was stored in a folder locked behind multiple layers of access. On paper, I didn't exist. I was listed as a support contractor. Not military, not civilian, not assigned, just a ghost. That's the nature of DIA work. You don't leave fingerprints. You leave suggestions. At first, I was underestimated. A young woman with a measured voice. They would hand me transcripts and assume I was simply proofreading. But then I'd correct a misheard idiom that transformed a vague threat into a specific attack plan. Or I'd identify a tone shift in an intercepted voice memo, signaling a change in allegiance. They started to take notice. And when they didn't, I didn't care. I didn't need credit. I needed to be right. But even when missions succeeded, when operations were salvaged and lives protected, my name never surfaced. Because people like me don't receive medals. We receive burn phones and signed memoranda and 1-line debriefings that read, "Status contained." I remember sitting in a freezing tent outside Aleppo, interpreting a hostage negotiation that involved 6 dialects, 3 shell companies, and a man who had once insisted he needed no translator. until I demonstrated he had been deceived into selling weapons to the wrong militia. The soldier beside me, an intel officer from another branch, looked over and asked, "You ever get tired of being invisible?" I smiled. "Invisibility is a weapon," I said. "You just have to learn how to hold it without cutting yourself." He never asked again. Over 6 years, I became the person dispatched when no one else could resolve the situation. I didn't always carry a weapon, but I carried knowledge. And in rooms where no one shared a common language, that was the most dangerous thing you could bring. Still, back at headquarters, I was known as the language girl. That's what they called me in passing. Not Ghostwalker, not even Bridget, just the girl with the notebook, the earpiece, the steady tone. A soldier once joked, "You're like the UN with legs." I laughed because he meant no harm, but he didn't understand either. What I did wasn't translation. It was decoding people. Fear has a tone. Greed has a rhythm. Regret lives in the pauses. I didn't just hear words. I heard the spaces between them. Still, my name remained locked away. And I was at peace with that. Until I wasn't. Until one mission went wrong. Until someone leaked information they should never have possessed. Until it became unmistakably clear that the system I had worked so hard to protect had fractures deep enough for a ghost to fall through. And I was no longer simply a ghost. I was a target. But that chapter hadn't arrived yet. Not in those first 6 years. Back then, I was just the quiet woman with the worn boots and the perfect memory. The one who never sought recognition. The one whose father still believed she filed paperwork behind a desk. The one who, every time she entered a room, made it just a little safer, without anyone ever understanding why. The mission in Syria was supposed to be clean. Quick coordination, low profile, limited exposure. I was embedded with a small unit outside Al-Hasaka, serving as a cultural liaison. On the surface, the operation was humanitarian. Meet with local intermediaries, secure medical logistics, verify safe evacuation routes for civilians. But beneath that surface, it was something else entirely. There was a name, one asset buried within layers of tribal negotiation, whose intelligence could dismantle the financial network of an arms smuggling ring that had evaded detection for years. We were close. Too close. Then the message arrived. A voice over our comms, in Arabic, but not the local dialect. It asked for me by name. Not my code name. My real name. Bridget. It cut through the channel like broken glass. I went still. Staff Sergeant Keller, standing beside me, went pale. "How in hell would anyone out here know your name?" he asked. I didn't respond. The next 30 minutes unraveled rapidly. A routine roadside check-in turned into an ambush. 3 local informants vanished. Our safe house was compromised. We shifted to fallback protocol, but it was too late. The unit's coordinates had already been exposed. A sniper round grazed Keller's arm. He bled across my scarf as I struggled to maintain pressure on the wound. And all I could think was, someone inside gave us away. When we finally extracted, airlifted to Herbal under communications blackout, I was met by 2 DI officers with expressionless faces. They said nothing at first, simply handing me a sealed folder and gesturing toward a soundproofed room. Inside was a transcript, a list of communications between the Washington field office and a clearance notation from Langley. My name was highlighted in red. Not my code name, not an alias, my actual name. They suggested it could have been a coincidence, that perhaps a third-party signal had been intercepted, that someone may have been impersonating one of our people. But they didn't believe that, and neither did I. The questioning was relentless. Had I communicated with anyone outside official channels? Had I discussed the asset with anyone? Had I left my equipment unattended? I answered every question calmly, including the ones engineered to destabilize me. But when asked whether I had any notion of how the breach had occurred, I told the truth. "I don't know," I said, but it wasn't me. They didn't accuse me of lying. They said nothing. They exchanged glances, wrote something down, and concluded the interview. Following that, I was pulled from field duty. Temporarily, they said, administrative reevaluation. It sounded cleaner than "we don't trust you." I was reassigned to a monitoring post in Germany. No operations, no assignments, just reports, summaries of conversations I wasn't permitted to hear in real time. Translation stripped of context. Analysis emptied of meaning. It felt like exile. But I didn't resist it because something in me already knew this wasn't simply the fallout of a failed mission. It was deliberate. Someone wanted me removed. Someone knew enough to make it appear I was the leak. And someone assumed I wouldn't notice. But they had underestimated the one thing that had always kept me alive: pattern recognition. Not merely in language, but in behavior and pressure points. The data didn't align. The communication chain was too pristine. The breach too targeted. It wasn't a careless error. It was surgical. And if someone within the system intended to erase me, they would need more than forged signals. They would need to silence everything I knew, every voice I carried, every word I had learned to transform into power. I could have escalated through the chain of command. But I understood how these things worked. Leakers are shielded when they're well-connected. Whistleblowers are buried when they're too isolated. So I waited. I watched. And in the stillness of that office in Stuttgart, I began constructing something new. Not a case file, not a formal complaint, a map. One that traced every signature, every timestamp, every anomaly. And when the moment arrived, when the right set of eyes was paying attention, I would ensure the silence broke. Not with noise, not with accusations, but with precision. Because if someone wanted me gone, they should have chosen a woman who only spoke one language. They forgot I speak 9. And every single one of them knows how to say, "I'm not finished yet." For months had passed in Syria. For months of silence, dressed up as protocol. For months of sitting behind a desk in Stuttgart, watching data drift past like ghost ships, no flags, no ports, no names. I told myself to be patient, that the system would eventually clear me, that facts would outlast whispers. But I knew better. Then the call came. I was 3 sips into a burnt cup of vending machine coffee when my secure line blinked. I wasn't expecting anyone. DI field numbers don't place calls unless something has gone wrong, or something's gone very, very right. I answered without giving my name. Bridget. The voice was familiar, clean, clipped, faintly surprised to still exist in my world. "Evan," I said. Evan Ashby had worked alongside me back in Georgia, long before Syria. We'd run a short operation tracking Farsi code switchers in black market arms negotiations. He was the kind of person who memorized encryption schemes for recreation and had once dismantled a Turkish smuggling ring because he recognized patterns in the way they used emojis. We hadn't spoken in over a year. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" he asked. "I'm DI in exile," I replied. "Every time is a bad time." He gave a dry chuckle, then paused. "Listen, I didn't call just to say hello." I leaned back, eyes narrowing. He continued, "I've been examining fragments from the Syria breach, the ones they declared too corrupted for analysis." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "They weren't corrupted," I said. "Just layered." Another pause. Layered? How structured? Like something designed to appear chaotic, but wasn't. A hollow sensation formed in my stomach. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm saying the sequence in that signature hash, the one tied to the signal that exposed your name, it wasn't random. It followed a proprietary cipher." "Whose?" A longer silence this time. "That's precisely why I called," Evans said slowly. "It matches the key design used in a contractor framework developed 6 years ago. Department of Defense Joint Encryption Licensing Project Alto." My breath caught. "I know that name," I said. "You should," Evan answered, "because the lead signatory for that framework was Colonel Thomas Lane." The words didn't arrive all at once. They fell one at a time, each heavier than the last. I stood, heart suddenly pounding the way it used on extraction nights. "No, there has to be an error," I said. "My father was involved with Alto, but he only signed oversight protocols, not the system design." "That's what I assumed as well," Evan said. "But the document trail doesn't lie." I heard keystrokes through the line. "I just sent you a sanitized trace. Check leak 47. I opened the file. It was unambiguous. Lane, Thomas H. Authorization level C4. Signature approval. Encryption lattice 12 delta. He hadn't simply reviewed the design. He had approved the encryption model itself. The same model used in the Syria breach. My mouth went dry. "It doesn't prove anything," I whispered. Evan didn't respond. I sat down heavily, eyes locked on the screen. It could have been copied, I offered. Reverse engineered. It could have, Evan replied. But then there's this. Another email arrived. A metadata tag log in the system 10 months prior, 3 months before Syria. Someone had accessed the Alto framework from a legacy terminal. The IP address traced to a location registered under a private consultancy firm based in Virginia. The listed executive contact, Thomas Lane. I didn't speak for a full minute. Not because I lacked words, but because if I spoke, I might scream. Evan finally said, I'm not accusing him of anything, but someone used his credentials or wanted it to appear that way. And either way, I said, my name was the one they burned. Exactly. I stared at the wall, my own reflection warped in the darkened window glass. I had spent years constructing a life that couldn't be touched, and now the breach had a shape, a signature, a history, a face, my father's face. I ended the call with a thank you I didn't mean. Then I sat in the dark, hands clenched, breathing slowly. If he had done it, I needed proof. If someone else had used him, I needed the trail. But either way, one thing was now undeniable. I'd been targeted from inside the house. After the call with Evan, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My body was still, but my mind operated like an engine stuck in overdrive. I spent the next 72 hours combing through digital archives that weren't supposed to be accessible. Retired contractor approvals, archived encryption logs, internal memoranda from procurement teams that had ceased to exist 5 years prior. I didn't use my DIA credentials. Too dangerous. I accessed through a dormant node once employed for black market surveillance on Eastern European tech firms. An access point I had constructed myself during the period when I still believed the system could protect itself. The pattern resolved faster than I expected. 6 documents, all connected to Project Alto or adjacent systems, all rubber-stamped with the same authorizing signature. Lane, Thomas H., Technical Policy Consultant. Level C for clearance. Temporary authority. I stared at that last phrase. Temporary authority. That wasn't standard procedure. It meant someone had granted my father elevated clearance on a provisional basis. No oversight, no audit trail. He didn't have to be on payroll. He didn't even have to be physically present. Just one email approval, one digital thumbprint. And suddenly, my father had been virtually in the room when encryption models were approved and deployed. I dug deeper. One contract stood out, an agreement between the DIA and a vendor called Redshore Analytics, a shell company based in Reston, Virginia. At first glance, it resembled routine support work, data lattice replication, and monitoring services. But the date stopped me cold. Signed and finalized January 4th. The Syria breach occurred in March. Redshore Analytics had installed a secondary data lattice into the DIA's Middle East signal chain, a back channel. And the final approval on the contract bore the name Thomas Lane. I felt it in my chest, sharp and electric, as if my body were issuing warnings my brain hadn't yet processed. I pulled the PDF and examined the metadata. The document had been signed digitally, encrypted with a multi-point hash, nearly impossible to forge unless the signer had surrendered their login credentials or been present when it was fabricated. I ran a timestamp sync. The approval had come through at 2:13 a.m. from a terminal registered to a private consultancy space shared by 3 other retired officers, one of whom had served alongside my father in Kandahar. It wasn't a smoking gun. Not yet. But it was more than smoke. It was ash. And if I was correct, if my father had knowingly authorized a contract that created the breach used to expose me, then this wasn't merely sabotage. It was betrayal. I leaned back in my chair. My spine ached. The room felt colder than it was. I tried to imagine his voice explaining it away. Maybe he'd claim it was all above board, that someone else had reviewed the contract, that he hadn't known what Redshore was truly doing. Maybe he'd say it wasn't personal, but it was because the breach had used my name, and whoever orchestrated it had done so knowing I would be in the field, knowing I would take the fall. I stared at the signature line once more. It wasn't just ink. It was intent. When I was 13, I had once forged my father's signature to get out of gym class. He found out and made me run laps until I vomited. He said a signature is a man's honor. You don't steal that. Now here I was, staring at his name, wondering whether it still meant anything at all. I downloaded the files, encrypted them under a new code tree, and saved them to a dead drop folder accessible to only one person, me. Then I sat in the dark, blinking against the glow of the screen, and whispered something I hadn't said aloud in years. Why? It wasn't a question directed at him. It was for myself. Because regardless of what the evidence showed, part of me still wanted to believe he wouldn't have done this. But belief is a treacherous thing in intelligence. Belief gets people killed. Evidence is safer, colder, cleaner. And the evidence was beginning to scream. The moment I had accumulated enough evidence to draw blood, just short of a complete accusation, I knew I couldn't proceed through official channels. Not directly, not as myself. The system had already marked me once. It wouldn't survive a second falter, and I had no intention of handing it another justification to bury me. So I composed a report. 8 pages. Coded references, metadata from the Redshore contract, terminal logs, encryption matches from the Syria breach. Each footnote pointed to a consultant with Level C4 clearance who had authorized irregular encryption access through a legacy framework. I omitted the name. Instead, I signed it under a temporary identity I had used years earlier during a counter-disinformation operation in Moldova. It still existed within a secure relay, never deactivated. To the DIA, I was Alex Marsh, External Systems Observer, Tier 3 access. Sufficient clearance to sound credible. Sufficient distance to make the report impossible to dismiss. I routed it through a narrow intelligence channel directly to Oversight Compliance Unit 3. OCU 3 handled internal irregularities and quiet anomalies. They weren't investigators. They were cleaners, but they paid close attention when whispers carried teeth. 3 days later, someone took the bait. A response arrived on the same secure node. Encrypted. High priority. It read, patterns confirmed. Proceeding with quiet escalation. Source acknowledged. Containment protocol initiated. Clean language. DI shorthand for, we believe you. We're handling it. Stay out of the way. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. They wanted room to move, not conversation. Over the following 2 weeks, I observed from a distance as internal traffic shifted. 3 senior contractors and logistics were placed on extended leave. Redshore Analytics was flagged for retroactive audit, and a non-public invitation was issued for a ceremony at Fort Belvoir, honoring select veterans and technical advisors for their contributions to long-term operational security. My father was among the names on that list. I read the memo twice. It was brief, polished, just enough detail to feel ceremonial rather than strategic. But I knew better. This wasn't a gesture of gratitude. It was bait. The DIA doesn't favor public confrontations. It doesn't expose individuals through press releases. It does so through pageantry, controlled environments, carefully curated witness lists, security monitoring every movement. The plan was subtle, merciless, and elegant. Invite the man who had helped authorize the breach. Place him in a room full of people who knew exactly what had transpired. Then let him watch as the very name he had tried to erase walked to the front of the room and was saluted. They weren't merely going to reveal me. They were going to make it unforgettable. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt cold because now that it was real, there was no reversing it. They hadn't told me I would be the centerpiece, but I understood who else could serve as proof. Who else could stand there and hold his gaze? They gave me a 2-line notice. You are requested for formal recognition at the Belvoir ceremony. Standard protocol will apply. No public naming. That last line made me smile. No public naming. But everyone in that room would know precisely who I was and what I represented. I ironed my uniform for the first time in a year. No medals, no stripes, just the standard fabric. Quiet, unadorned. Like me. The day before the ceremony, one final update came through the Ghost channel. It was from OCU-3. Secondary targets confirmed. All observers will be present. Commander Latimer will initiate exposure. Maintain posture. Do not engage. I memorized it, deleted it, sat alone in my apartment, and thought about how long I had been waiting for this moment. Not to be seen, but to be believed. I didn't know what my father would do when he saw me. I didn't know whether he would connect the breach to his own signature or whether he already had. But I knew this. I wouldn't need to say a single word. My presence would accomplish what my voice never could. And in the silence that followed, the system would finally speak back. The room smelled of polished wood and regulation coffee. Quiet conversation rippled beneath the low hum of fluorescent lights. There were medals pinned to jacket lapels, starch in every collar, and the kind of silence where sincerity used to live. Fort Belvoir's main hall looked like a space that had never encountered doubt. But today it was saturated with it. I arrived 15 minutes early, as instructed, escorted through a side entrance. My name was absent from the program. Not even my alias, just a silent checkmark beside confirmed. They seated me in row 3, seat 4. No name placard, no unit designation. I wore my uniform plain, stripped of ribbons and rank insignia. To most people in that room, I was a quiet observer, one among many. Except not everyone thought that. I caught a few glances, subtle, swift, a flicker of recognition here, a narrowed gaze there. The kind of looks that communicated, I've heard stories. But no one approached me directly. I didn't need them to. I wasn't there to be greeted. I was there to be revealed. At precisely 0900, the ceremony commenced. An aide stepped to the podium, cleared his throat, and opened a small leather binder. Today, he began, we honor those whose contributions to long-range operational intelligence have made this country more secure, often without anyone knowing their names. A few heads dipped in routine acknowledgement. I heard my father before I saw him. His voice still carried that same crisp edge, like boot heels on tile. He was seated across the aisle in the VIP section up front. Polished shoes, flawless posture, uniform tailored for a man who never aged in his own estimation. They announced him second. Colonel Thomas Lane, retired, former technical advisor to the Joint Encryption Task Force, Project Alto. Measured applause. He stood, nodded once, self-assured but not theatrical. He hadn't seen me yet. The ceremony moved quickly, deliberately so. Most names were referenced only by initials or project designations. One by one, they stepped forward, received a nod, and returned to their seats. Then came the pause. The leather binder closed. The aide stepped back. A new figure approached the podium. General Latimer. Tall, graveled voice, a face worn by war. He didn't smile. He surveyed the room the way a man scans terrain through fog, searching for a precise target. When he spoke, his tone dropped half an octave. This next recognition is not ceremonial. It is corrective. We are here to acknowledge a contribution that has reshaped the landscape of modern intelligence gathering, without recognition, without protection, and until recently, without a name. The room shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. I felt the current move through chairs and shoes and throats that had suddenly gone dry. My father leaned slightly forward. Latimer continued, there is someone in this room who was marked once, not for what they failed to accomplish, but for what they did too well. Someone whose work has saved lives, dismantled enemy networks, and navigated more linguistic and cultural terrain than most of us could name. The pause that followed was weightless. The room held its breath. He looked up. Then he said it. We need Ghostwalker in the room. 6 words. Nothing more. But they landed like an alarm no one had heard in years. No announcement followed. No spotlight. Just silence. Then I stood. Row 3, seat 4. One fluid movement, no hesitation. He didn't look at me first. My father, I mean. He looked left, then right, attempting to locate the source. When I stepped into the aisle, he turned, and everything in his expression went still. No anger, no confusión. Just recognition. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Then, slowly he stood. Not with ceremony, not with pride, but like a man standing because he is no longer certain what else remains solid. I walked down the aisle. Each step was made quieter by the fact that no one else moved. No one whispered. No one applauded. I passed rows of decorated uniforms, pressed hands, set jaws, but no one met my eyes. They didn't need to. They already knew. I reached the podium. General Latimer stepped back without offering me the microphone. He simply nodded once. Respectful. Final. I returned the nod, then turned to face the room. I didn't salute. I didn't speak. I simply stood. And in that stillness, the only audible sound was fabric shifting as officers straightened in their seats, heads dipping, spines stiffening. Recognition doesn't always require ceremony. Sometimes it only requires time. Time to finally catch up with the truth. I looked at my father, still standing, still staring. His mouth parted slightly, but no words emerged. Because what does a man say when the daughter he dismissed becomes the proof that he was wrong? He didn't sit down until I returned to my seat. And even then, he never looked away. 6 words had shattered the script. But it was the silence that followed which told me he would never be able to write another one. My father didn't leave the hall immediately after the ceremony concluded. He didn't shake hands or join the post-event briefing with the other retirees. He simply stood near the rear exit beneath the insignia of the Intelligence Support Command, gripping his phone as though it were the last fixed point in a shifting world. I watched from distance. He wasn't pacing, wasn't visibly agitated. He looked disoriented, like a man whose compass had spun entirely off its axis. I could have approached him. I could have said something, but I didn't. There exists a silence more formidable than any accusation, and I had earned the right to use it. Instead, I waited. 5 minutes later, he finally moved, slow and deliberate, as though his boots were heavier than he remembered. He stepped outside to the far edge of the parking lot, where a flag snapped softly in the wind. That's where he placed the call. I know it was said only because Evan, my contact at DIA, was monitoring that line, not out of distrust, but because a man like Thomas Lane doesn't change unless forced to confront something undeniable. We needed to know how he would carry the truth. He dialed a number labeled Charlie J. Old school, probably a colleague from his deployment years. The line connected. My father didn't wait for pleasantries. "Charlie," he said, "you ever hear of Ghostwalker?" A prolonged pause followed on the other end. Then a voice, steady and flat. "No idea who she is. But I know one thing. If Ghostwalker was in the room, the mission lived." My father didn't respond immediately. He exhaled audibly, the kind of exhale that draws something out of a man's chest without his awareness. "Say that again," he asked. I said. Charlie repeated, "I don't know her name, but I know the code name. Every unit that's ever had Ghostwalker in the operation file came home." My father went quiet again. Not from confusion this time, from realignment. I could imagine his mind moving backwards, trying to match years of unnamed successes and coded reports to me. Bridget, his daughter, the one he had once declared useless with a map, the one who had never discharged a real weapon, the one who annotated foreign newspapers with a red pen and studied syntax patterns as though they mattered more than marksmanship, the one who never received a single acknowledgement in her own home. I don't know how long he stood out there, but by the time he ended the call, the sun had begun descending behind the Virginia tree line. He didn't return inside. He didn't stop to speak with anyone. He walked slowly to his vehicle, keys clenched in his fist, but instead of starting the engine, he sat motionless for a moment, staring through the windshield. Not at the road, not at the building, just into the fading dusk. And I stood just inside the double doors, watching his silhouette through the glass. It didn't look like victory. It didn't even resemble regret. It looked like recalibration, like a man attempting to rewrite an entire story he had been telling himself for decades. A story about power, about worth, about his legacy, and about me. I didn't need his apology. Not then. Perhaps not ever. Because there are truths that don't demand apology. They demand acknowledgement. And today, he had no choice but to grant it. The man who had raised me to believe I was ordinary had just learned, before a room full of officers, that I had been anything but. He would drive home that night past familiar street signs, past the base where he used to receive salutes, and into a house that had never echoed with recognition for his daughter, but which now held the name Ghostwalker somewhere between its walls. He would pour himself a drink. He would sit in his usual chair, but the room wouldn't feel the same because silence has a shape and mine had finally assumed its place. And perhaps when he turned on the evening news and heard of a near-miss operation intercepted in real time, he would pause, listen, and wonder whether I had been in the room. He wouldn't call. Not yet, but I didn't require a phone call because I had already spoken more eloquently than any words ever could. My name was Bridget Lane, but to every commander who mattered, to every survivor of a mission that should have collapsed, to every strategist who found meaning in maps, codes, dialects, and silence, I was Ghostwalker, and now so was he, whether he wanted to be or not. They say the ceremony is where titles are conferred, but the lounge, that's where verdicts are reached. It wasn't long after I had stepped away from the podium, my name still resonating in a dozen minds, that I entered the officer's lounge with a paper cup of burnt coffee and a head full of quiet. At first, no one spoke. The kind of silence that presents itself as respect but smells of evaluation. Then, just behind a tall vending machine near the rear table, I heard the first murmur. "Ghostwalker, for real?" The voice followed with a snort. "She's a linguist. She sits at a desk, not behind a trigger." Another voice joined, pitched lower, feigning seriousness while barely suppressing a smirk. "Maybe it's a PR strategy. Slap a compelling code name on desk analysts. Call it tactical branding." Restrained laughter. Not explosive, not confident. The kind that requires company to sustain itself. They didn't know I was there yet. Didn't realize the walls carried more than sound. Didn't understand that words spoken sideways still travel in straight lines. "She's only been field deployed twice," another voice offered. "The whole Syria file is redacted." A pause. "Convenient, huh?" "Convenient or classified?" Someone pushed back. That one caught me off guard. It was measured, quiet. I recognized the voice. Major Lawson. He had served in Tunisia when I interpreted a rebel code before it reached our convoy. He didn't raise his voice, but a subtle fracture opened in the silence around him. One of the others responded, half-jokingly. "Classified is just a sophisticated word for unverifiable." And then a deeper voice. "She's done more than most of you in this room, and she's never once bragged about it." The atmosphere shifted. Subtly, a chair scraped the floor. A cup was set down too firmly. Major Dawson, a logistics officer from Georgia, he had reviewed my reports and once told me my analysis had saved a $3 million equipment drop. No one argued back directly. They simply redirected, shifting the conversation toward a new AI protocol being trialed in drone mapping. But the air had changed. No one said anything to my face. No one risked a quip or a jab. Because people don't mock a shadow. And now they no longer knew where my edges were. But mockery, I've come to understand, doesn't always wear a uniform. It arrives dressed as doubt. It infiltrates the corners of conversation, not loud enough to confront, but sharp enough to leave a mark. As I stood by the window nursing my coffee, I could still hear it. "Ghostwalker, come on." Fluent in 9 languages. Not exactly firepower. She probably writes poetry in Farsi. I didn't flinch. Didn't correct them. Didn't explain how poetry in Farsi had once disarmed a Taliban negotiator long enough for us to extract a wounded interpreter from an ambush zone. I didn't explain that 9 languages were not ornamental. There were shields, blades, lifelines, and sometimes the only keys to doors no one else could see. Because here's what they failed to grasp. Recognition, when it finally arrives, doesn't silence the echoes of mockery. It simply gives them a stage on which to embarrass themselves. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need their applause. What I needed, what I had always needed, was to hear them and to choose not to diminish myself the way they were diminishing me. A captain walked past me, paused, and nodded. Then a younger officer, Second Lieutenant Ramirez, approached. He was visibly nervous, gripping a folder too tightly. "I just wanted to say, I read your analysis on the Baltic packet last year. It helped us break through a dead channel." I nodded, glad it was useful. He lingered briefly, then walked away. Not hurriedly, not slowly. The mockers noticed, and they resented it, because when you mock someone who refuses to react, you expect them to shrink. But when others begin to perceive that the silence isn't weakness but control, mockery starts to turn inward. I left the lounge 10 minutes later without looking back. And in the corridor outside, I passed a junior analyst staring at my name on the announcement board. She didn't speak, but her eyes weren't mocking. They weren't skeptical. They were curious. And that was all I needed. After the ceremony, I anticipated tension, but not absence. My father didn't approach me, didn't remain for the reception, didn't extend a handshake or even a nod. He left the building the moment the applause subsided, head raised, spine straight, as though performing a pretense that his world had not just fundamentally shifted. For 3 days, there was nothing. No text, no call, not a word through any family channel. Then, on the 4th morning, I opened my email. No subject line, no signature, just a single attachment, a file labeled with nothing. Empty, except for one sentence positioned dead center on a blank white page. If I sign a confession, will you go public? No greeting, no context, just that. For a moment, I stopped breathing. I stared at those words as if they were encoded, encrypted not in language, but in shame, in fear, in calculation. Because he knew, he had known, perhaps even before the ceremony, or perhaps the moment those 6 words fell in that room. We need Ghostwalker in the room. He had begun assembling the pieces. Thomas Lane was not a foolish man. He had survived 3 combat tours and authored 2 military ethics manuals. But ethics are more easily written than lived. I didn't reply immediately. I closed the file, stepped away, sat on the floor of my apartment with my back against the refrigerator, and stared at the ceiling for nearly an hour. What he was truly asking had nothing to do with guilt. It was about control. He didn't seek forgiveness. He didn't offer clarity. He didn't say he was sorry. He asked for containment. He asked whether I would protect the legacy he still clung to like a fraying flag. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small beneath his shadow. I opened my laptop and replied with a single line, "No, but I'm not the child afraid of the light anymore." I didn't threaten to expose him. I didn't promise I wouldn't. I simply stated the truth. The balance of power had shifted. I no longer required his name, his validation, or his permission. I had become a force on my own terms, a name whispered in black site debriefings, a silhouette in mission logs too sensitive to publish. I had lived behind codes and clearance tiers, but now I walked in full uniform with nothing left to prove. He didn't respond. Not that day, not the next. But I knew he had read it, because later that week, a quiet notification appeared on my phone. An alert from an encrypted archive folder I had forgotten was still synchronized to my home network. My father had accessed a file, the original Syria deployment cipher, the one carrying his approval signature buried in the metadata. It didn't constitute proof of guilt, but it proved awareness. And in silence, he confirmed what I had long suspected. He hadn't sabotaged the system. He had simply looked away when someone else did to protect an arrangement, a position, perhaps simply a comfortable retirement. Cowardice, not corruption, but cowardice still leaves blood on the floor. That weekend, I drove back to the old house. Not to visit, just to stand before it. It hadn't changed. The same cracked concrete path, the same squeaking porch swing, the same closed blinds, even on a Sunday morning. I didn't knock. I had no interest in another wordless room. Instead, I took out my phone, opened my notes, and wrote one final message I never sent. You raised a daughter fluent in 9 languages, but you never learned the simplest one, truth. I closed it, saved it in a locked folder labeled unsent, then turned and walked back to the car. Because some things are worthy of remaining unspoken. Not because they don't matter, but because saying them wouldn't change who he is. And it wouldn't change who I've become. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the notification arrived. An encrypted message routed through DIA's internal relay, flagged as sensitive but non-operational. The subject line read, "Confirmation, disciplinary hearing, case internal compromise 647B." My breath caught. I opened the file. Thomas Lane had presented himself voluntarily at a classified internal hearing, not as a subject of investigation, but under personal disclosure. He walked, uninvited and unsummoned, into a secure conference room in Arlington. He sat across from a panel of ethics officers and intelligence auditors, and he said 7 words, "I authorized a contractor I didn't vet." There was no drama, no attempt to deflect blame. He stated it plainly. 6 years ago, he had fast-tracked an encryption contract because the firm had been recommended by a fellow officer with political ties. He signed without conducting a complete code analysis. He didn't flag the anomalies. He didn't identify the open back door in the transmission layer. Or perhaps he did and didn't act. Either way, he accepted full responsibility. He was asked whether he knew who had reported the breach. He looked them in the eye and said no, but I suspect I owe her everything. He never spoke my name. Not to them, not in writing, but in the transcript, one line was underlined and flagged. I made a critical error. I accept all consequences. I ask only one condition. Keep my daughter's name off every record. He could have denied everything. He could have gone silent. He could have let the weight fall wherever it chose. Instead, he drew a circle of protection, not around himself, but around me. That was the first genuine act of fatherhood I had ever witnessed from him. The DI accepted the statement. All peripheral names were redacted. The file was sealed. Quiet sanctions were initiated. Thomas Lane lost all consulting privileges. His security clearance was suspended. He returned his badges and relinquished his military advisory titles. No press release was issued. No public announcement. They allowed him to exit through the side door. Quietly, finally, without applause or judgment. A week later, a small brown envelope arrived in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single object, his West Point pin, the one he never removed, not for surgeries, not for international travel. The one I had once reached for as a child and been told, this is for soldiers, not for those who quit. He included no note. He didn't need to. For the first time, his silence wasn't absence. It was acknowledgement. I held that pin in my palm for a long time, feeling its weight, its history, its quiet transformation and meaning. It wasn't a gift. It was a gesture, not of approval, but of surrender. A passing of honor from a man who had finally understood that medals mean nothing without the courage to face your own failures. I never wore it. I keep it tucked in a locked drawer beside the Syria report, the deployment cipher, and the unsigned message I wrote and never sent. Because legacy, I've come to understand, isn't measured in headlines or decorations. It's defined by what you do when no one applauds, when no one is watching, when the only recognition comes from the truth settling quietly in your chest. Belmano, earned. They never spoke the name Ghostwalker in my father's presence again, not out of unease, but out of respect. And he never again asked whether I would go public, because he finally understood that I didn't need to. The justice I sought was never about his undoing. It was about proving I could stand beside him, not behind him, that I could walk into a room and say my name, Bridget Lane, and still be seen. And for once in his life, he allowed that to happen. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday. Top left corner, Department of Defense, Intelligence Analysis Division. Top right, my name, Bridget Lane. The body was concise and direct. Subject, voluntary reassignment. Field operations to strategic oversight. Status, approved, effective immediately. I had signed a request myself, of course. No one compelled me to step back from the field. There was no scandal attached to my name, no reprimand, no quiet pressure from above. The truth was far simpler than that. I had spent 11 years in rooms that never knew my real name, on missions where identity was as disposable as a location. I had spoken 9 languages and kept my own voice small. I had authored entire escape protocols, redirected convoys, neutralized threats, all without once entering the credit column. I was a ghost, and I was proud of it. But something changed after that ceremony. Not only in my father, in me. I no longer required the shadows. And so I requested a reassignment. Director of Strategic Language and Cultural Intelligence Training. It didn't sound thrilling. It didn't generate headlines or come with covert operations. But it meant building the next generation, shaping minds rather than just missions. It meant taking everything I had gathered from the field, the missed signals, the dialect missteps, the cultural blind spots, and ensuring that no one walked into those gaps without preparation. At DIA's Northern Virginia campus, my office had a real window. My badge displayed my real name. And for the first time, I didn't flinch when someone used it in a corridor. I redesigned the training curriculum myself. Structured modules around actual extraction failures and communication breakdowns. built live simulations using audio from past operations, names redacted, truth preserved. I recruited veterans who had once been skeptics, linguists who had never stepped into a combat zone, technical officers with minds sharper than any blade. We functioned as a unit, unseen, essential. We called it the listening lab, because listening, I believed, was the foundational form of respect in any operation, and the most consistently overlooked. In the third month of my new role, a junior recruit came into my office holding a printed briefing on my past field assignments. He had gone digging beyond his standard clearance level. He sat down, visibly uncertain. "Ma'am," he said, "are you really Ghostwalker?" I could see him bracing for a denial, a deflection, some polished, bureaucratic non-answer. Instead, I asked, "What did the name Ghostwalker mean to you before today?" He blinked. It meant whoever it was. They saved lives without needing to be seen. I nodded. "Then keep believing that." He smiled, stood, and saluted. I didn't return the salute, not out of disrespect, but because I had never once asked for it. That evening, I found myself opening the locked drawer where my father's pen rested. I held it briefly, cool, solid, heavier now that I understood its full story. Then I set it beside something new, a printed syllabus labeled Ghost Operative Linguistics 101. Not as a declaration of pride, for continuity, because stories like mine shouldn't disappear. They should evolve. I never saw my father again in uniform. He retired quietly, relocated out west, and spent his days rebuilding an old Cessna alongside a neighbor's child. Through mutual connections, I learned he never spoke of Ghostwalker, but he kept a file folder labeled DI Language Division tucked alongside his military records at home. One day, I believe he'll share a story with that neighbor's child. Perhaps not about me, perhaps not by name, but something about what it means to serve without demanding acknowledgement, to admit failure without flinching, and to love someone without fully understanding them until it's nearly too late. And that is enough. I used to believe the world divided itself neatly between applause and silence, that you either generated noise or ceased to exist. But I know better now. There's a third place, a steady, quiet hum where unannounced impact lives, where stories aren't broadcast but passed along in small, true ways, like a pin in a drawer, or a name whispered during a training exercise, or a voice that remains steady while speaking in a language someone finally comprehends. That's where I live now, not as a ghost, not as a daughter straining to earn a nod, but as Bridget Lane, instructor, architect, survivor, and still, even without the shadows, still a walker between worlds. It was a Thursday when I first stepped into the classroom, not a field operation, not a mission briefing, not a debriefing in a secure bunker beneath red lights and code names. This was different. The hallway was brightly lit. The walls were bare except for a few framed maps and timelines. The room itself was quiet, sterile in its arrangement, but alive with possibility. On the door was a small metal plate. Nothing official, nothing dramatic. Just 4 simple words, laser-etched, the Ghostwalker room. I paused. There was no ceremony, no grand unveiling. No one standing nearby, awaiting my reaction. But somewhere, someone had made a deliberate choice to put a name on a door, to acknowledge what had always been invisible. I didn't ask who had done it. Instead, I ran my hand gently across the letters and smiled. Not because I required the title, not because it healed every silence or erased every wound, but because for once, it felt as though the world had quietly whispered back. This time, we saw you. Inside, 12 officers sat in precise rows, majors, lieutenants, a few commanders. Not students exactly, veterans in need of a new language. On the whiteboard, I wrote the course title, Strategic Intercultural Communication for High-Stakes Environments. Beneath it, in smaller letters, Understanding as a Mission Asset. Then I turned to face them and began. I told them we wouldn't be opening with phrases or grammatical structures. We'd begin with the hardest part, the silence between words, the suspended moment before a mistranslation, the held breath before a cultural misstep, the precise instant when intent shatters against assumption. I gave them stories, not mine, not initially, but ones I had gathered from every country my boots had ever touched. Moments when communication failed not from ignorance, but because someone hadn't thought to truly listen. They were reserved at first, but slowly, as the weeks progressed, they began to lean forward. They asked questions. They challenged ideas. They disagreed, thoughtfully, respectfully, and occasionally I would witness something new bloom across their faces. Humility. One evening after class, as I was gathering my files, a commander lingered. He asked quietly, "Did you really serve under the name Ghostwalker?" I looked up. He wasn't asking out of reverence. It wasn't admiration. It was genuine curiosity, and perhaps a question beneath the question. How do you carry that name without being crushed by its weight? I nodded. But the title matters far less than what you do with it. He smiled and left, and I stood there alone for a while, allowing the quiet to settle around me like a familiar, well-worn coat. That evening, I walked home beneath a gentle rain, not heavy, just enough to soften the edges of the city. When I reached my door, a small box rested on the porch. No return address, no signature, but the handwriting on the label, I recognized it instantly. Inside was a photograph, faded but intact. It was me at 10 years old, seated on the floor, a tattered book open in my lap, eyes wide, caught mid-sentence, the kind of image no one ever poses for. Beneath it, a single folded sheet of paper, typed and centered. You once said you wanted to change the world with intelligence. Maybe you did. No signature. I didn't need one. My father had never learned to say, "I'm proud of you," in any of the 9 languages I spoke. But he had just said it now, in the only one that truly mattered. The language of acknowledgement. It had taken him a lifetime, and it had taken me nearly as long to understand that some people love you in dialects you were never taught to hear, in silences and half glances and gestures like folded paper tucked inside quiet boxes. We never spoke again after that, but it was enough, because the last thing he ever sent me wasn't doubt or dismissal or another quiet reminder of who I wasn't. It was a photograph of a girl who believed that words could move the world, and a father who had finally, at last, let her. I pinned it to the corkboard beside my desk, not to remind me of him, but to remind me of the promise I made when I was that girl, that intelligence is only meaningful when it serves understanding. That precision without empathy is nothing more than noise, and that the deepest truths often speak without any sound at all. Before we close, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late evening where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one with gratitude. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not simply to hear more stories like this, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story forward. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive with a knock at the door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.